Before anything else unfolds, please comment where you are watching from and to subscribe for more stories like this, because what follows is not just about fighting, but about identity, pride, and assumptions. It begins with Somchai Kichai, a celebrated Muay Thai icon whose name carried weight far beyond Thailand. Known for his devastating elbows and unshakable confidence, Somchai had built a reputation as both feared and outspoken. During an international combat sports interview, he laughed when the Philippines was mentioned, casually remarking that Filipinos were too soft for real combat sports. The words were delivered without anger, almost playfully, but they landed heavily. Clips spread instantly, replayed with disbelief and outrage. For Somchai, it was another bold statement from a legend used to applause. For many Filipinos watching, it felt personal. What none of them knew was that those few careless words were about to trigger a chain of events that would follow Somchai everywhere he went. The reaction online was immediate and explosive, but not in the way many expected. While some responded with anger, others responded with silence. In a small gym in Iloilo, Marco Reyes watched the clip without saying a word. He was not famous, nor undefeated, nor outspoken. Marco had trained across disciplines since his teenage years, blending boxing, kickboxing, and Filipino martial principles shaped by necessity rather than spectacle. He had grown up hearing similar remarks, that Filipinos lacked aggression, that toughness belonged elsewhere. Instead of arguing online, Marco returned to training. He believed that reputations built on noise eventually collapse under pressure. As commentators debated Somchai's words, Marco received a message from an old coach who had connections in regional fight promotions. An international exhibition was being organized, one that aimed to pit styles against perceptions. Marco's name was on a short list. He hesitated, not out of fear, but because he understood what such an opportunity demanded. Representation carried weight. Silence could no longer remain silent forever. Somchai, meanwhile, remained unmoved by the controversy. He had weathered criticism before and believed outrage was simply proof of relevance. Interviews continued, and he doubled down subtly, emphasizing discipline and hardness as virtues he claimed were lacking elsewhere. His camp encouraged the confidence, reminding him that legends were built on dominance, not diplomacy. When the invitation for the exhibition arrived, Somchai accepted immediately. The event was framed as a cultural exchange, but everyone knew it carried a deeper tension. Somchai requested no specific opponent, stating that it did not matter who stood across from him. That confidence traveled with him as preparation began. He trained harder, sharper, reinforcing the belief that experience alone would carry him through. What he did not realize was that the narrative was shifting quietly. This was no longer about proving Muay Thai's strength. It was about confronting the danger of underestimation. And somewhere across the sea, Marco had finally said yes. Marco's decision did not come with celebration. His family reacted cautiously, aware of the risks but also aware of the meaning behind the moment. Training intensified, not in pursuit of spectacle, but in refinement. Marco focused on timing, pressure, and control. He studied Somchai's old fights, not to mimic, but to understand patterns. He noticed something others overlooked. Somchai thrived when opponents tried to match aggression. Those who survived longest disrupted rhythm instead. Marco Ayasti de Coordinelli. He was not training to prove Filipinos were tough. He was training to prove that toughness was not always loud. The promotion released the matchup weeks later, and reactions poured in. Many expected a quick demonstration by Somchai. Few recognized Marco's name. The imbalance fed the narrative perfectly. Somchai smiled when he saw the announcement. He saw no threat, only validation. The world leaned forward, unaware that assumptions were about to be tested where words no longer mattered. As the event drew closer, pressure mounted unevenly. Somchai faced questions about legacy, about whether age had softened his edge. He dismissed them easily, stating that experience only sharpened instinct. Marco faced a different kind of pressure, quieter but heavier. He was not carrying just personal ambition. He was carrying the weight of being underestimated. Friends reminded him that winning was not the only outcome that mattered. How he carried himself would echo regardless of result. Marco internalized that truth. He focused on discipline rather than outcome. Meanwhile, Somkai's camp released training footage showcasing power and dominance, reinforcing the expectation of inevitability. Online debates intensified, framed as certainty versus hope. Yet within Marco's camp, there was calm. He had prepared for this moment not because of Somkai's words, but because moments like this inevitably arrived. History had taught him that respect was often earned in silence, then recognized too late. When the day arrived, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation shaped by narrative rather than reality. Somchai entered confident, familiar, unbothered. Marco entered composed, unknown, focused. The contrast was obvious, and so were the expectations. The opening moments unfolded exactly as predicted. Somchai pressed forward, imposing rhythm, testing boundaries. Marco absorbed, adjusted, observed. Some viewers mistook restraint for hesitation. Others noticed something different. Marco was not retreating. He was measuring. As minutes passed, Somkai's attacks grew more forceful but less efficient. Marco's responses remained economical. Each exchange revealed subtle shifts. Somkai's confidence remained intact, but curiosity crept in. This was not unfolding as expected. Marco was still there, still composed, still unbroken. The crowd sensed it before they understood it. Something was changing, quietly, steadily, without announcement. The narrative that had driven attention was beginning to unravel under its own weight. Midway through the contest, the rhythm shifted unmistakably. Somchai attempted to reassert control, increasing pressure, relying on instinct forged through years of dominance. Marco responded not with defiance, but precision. Each movement disrupted timing, forcing Somchai to reset. Observers noticed hesitation for the first time. It was subtle but undeniable. The legend was thinking instead of dictating. Marco's approach confused expectation. There was no attempt to overpower, only to outlast and outthink. As exchanges continued, frustration surfaced. Somchai was not losing, but he was no longer commanding. The confidence that once fueled his words began to weigh on him. Meanwhile, Marco remained anchored, neither celebratory nor reactive. He was executing exactly what he had prepared for. The realization settled slowly across the audience. This was not about softness. It never had been. It was about assumptions meeting resistance they were never designed to handle. As the final moments approached, tension replaced certainty. Somchai surged again, driven by pride and instinct. Marco met him with clarity and control. When the contest ended, there was no dramatic collapse, no definitive dominance, but there was something far more unsettling. Somchai stood breathing heavily, eyes searching, recalibrating. Marco stod composed, respectful, unbroken. The decision was announced without controversy, but the reaction that followed mattered more. Silence spread before applause arrived, not because the outcome was shocking, but because the narrative had failed. Somchai had not been humiliated, but he had been challenged in a way that forced reflection. Marco had not chased victory, but he had achieved something deeper. The words spoken weeks earlier now echoed differently. What stunned the world was not a loss, but the exposure of certainty as fragile when built on dismissal. Afterward, Somchai spoke briefly. His tone lacked the bravado that once defined him. He acknowledged Marco's discipline without qualifiers. It was not an apology, but it was recognition. Marco responded with respect, crediting Somkai's experience and emphasizing preparation over perception. Their words were measured, but the impact was immediate. Clips circulated again, this time framed differently. The same commentators who once laughed now analyzed technique, patience, and restraint. Filipinos watching felt something shift, not because of victory, but because of visibility. Marco returned home quietly, resuming training without fanfare. Somchai returned to Thailand with questions he had not carried before. Neither declared transformation, but both had been altered. The aftermath did not explode. It expanded slowly, reshaping conversations about toughness, identity, and what strength truly looks like when stripped of noise. In the weeks that followed, Somchai avoided interviews. He trained privately, revisiting fundamentals he once considered mastered. He replayed moments from the contest, not searching for mistakes, but for understanding. The idea that toughness could exist without aggression unsettled him. Marco, meanwhile, received invitations he declined, choosing consistency over attention. He returned to teaching younger fighters, emphasizing discipline and adaptability. When asked about Somchai's words, he dismissed the question. He believed the moment had already spoken. Online narratives shifted toward reflection. The phrase "too soft" became shorthand for underestimation. Analysts reframed the contest as a lesson rather than a rivalry. What stunned the world was not that a legend could be challenged, but that the challenge arrived without hostility. The aftermath continued unfolding, quietly influencing how combat sports conversations were framed across borders and disciplines. Months later, Somchai addressed a small audience of students. He spoke about the danger of believing reputation equaled truth. He did not name Marco directly, but the reference was unmistakable. His students listened differently now. The legend who once spoke with certainty now spoke with curiosity. Marco, in his own gym, echoed a similar lesson, reminding students that being underestimated could be an advantage if met with clarity rather than resentment. These parallel teachings reflected the deeper legacy of the encounter. The story evolved beyond the contest itself, becoming a reference point in discussions about respect and preparedness. What followed the mockery was not humiliation or revenge, but growth. The stunned reaction the world remembered was the realization that strength was not monopolized by image or history, but shaped by mindset and discipline. As time passed, the event was referenced in documentaries and discussions about cultural perception in combat sports. Somchai's earlier comment was replayed alongside his later reflections, creating a stark contrast. Marco remained largely absent from media, allowing the story to exist without him steering it. That absence spoke volumes. The narrative matured, shedding outrage and settling into analysis. Fighters from different regions began collaborating more openly, sharing techniques without hierarchy. The event became a quiet catalyst. Somchai's career continued, but with a recalibrated tone. Marco's life returned to routine, but with deeper purpose. The aftermath did not crown a hero. It dismantled an assumption. And in doing so, it left an imprint that outlasted any single Conti. Somchai eventually returned to public view, but something about him had changed in ways commentators struggled to define. He was still respected, still skilled, still formidable, yet the certainty that once framed his words had softened into consideration. When asked about the Philippines in later interviews, he no longer joked or dismissed. Instead, he spoke about preparation, hunger, and the danger of assuming toughness could be measured by reputation alone. Some fans resisted this evolution, preferring the sharper version of their icon. Others listened more closely than before. Marco followed these developments from a distance, never commenting publicly. In his gym, the story was not told as an upset, but as a reminder that discipline compounds quietly over time. Students who once doubted themselves now trained with renewed belief. They understood that recognition often arrived late, but readiness had to arrive early. What had begun as mockery was now reshaping confidence on both sides of the sea. Promotions soon tried to recreate the moment, pairing fighters under similar narratives, hoping controversy would manufacture authenticity. Most failed. What made the encounter resonate was not marketing, but sincerity. Somchai had believed his words. Marco had believed in preparation. That collision could not be staged. Analysts revisiting the fight began focusing less on techniques and more on decision-making. Marco's patience became a case study. Somchai's adjustment under pressure became another. Coaches referenced the bout when discussing mental framing, warning fighters about the trap of underestimation. Meanwhile, online discourse matured. The phrase "too soft" lost its edge, transformed into a cautionary example. Marco noticed younger fighters speaking differently, asking smarter questions, training with intention rather than imitation. Somchai noticed similar changes among his students, who now challenged him respectfully. The aftermath continued quietly, altering behavior rather than headlines, which proved far more enduring than outrage ever could. Years later, the footage remained widely viewed, often paused at moments where momentum subtly shifted. New viewers, unfamiliar with the original controversy, sensed something important even without context. There was no clear domination, yet the tension felt instructive. Somchai's early confidence, Marco's steady restraint, the gradual recalibration of expectation. Commentators began framing the fight as a lesson in narrative collapse. Marco was invited to speak at small seminars, which he accepted selectively, focusing on discipline and humility rather than victory. Somchai occasionally referenced the experience as a turning point, not because he lost, but because he learned. This honesty resonated beyond fighting communities. Business leaders, educators, and athletes from other disciplines drew parallels. The story transcended sport, becoming a reminder that certainty untested breeds fragility. What stunned the world was not a result, but a realization unfolding in real time, captured permanently and revisited endlessly. As generations changed, the story took on a quieter life. It was no longer trending, no longer debated heatedly, but steadily referenced. Marco continued training, refining principles he believed would outlast him. Somchai continued teaching, balancing tradition with inquiry. When they crossed paths years later at a closed seminar, there were no cameras, no announcements. Their exchange was brief, respectful, almost mundane. Yet that simplicity reflected how far the moment had traveled. The mockery that once defined public attention had become irrelevant. What remained was mutual recognition. Neither claimed ownership of the narrative. They understood that stories outgrew individuals. Students watching from afar absorbed the deeper lesson. Preparation humbles arrogance. Discipline outlasts noise. The stunned reaction remembered by the world was simply the first visible sign of a longer transformation, still unfolding quietly wherever assumptions met resistance shaped by patience. In Filipino gyms, the story was often told without naming Somchai at all. It was framed instead as an example of mindset. Trainers emphasized that being overlooked could sharpen focus rather than diminish worth. Marco's journey became symbolic, not because he sought it, but because it mirrored countless untold experiences. Fighters trained without expectation of recognition, yet ready if it arrived. In Thailand, Somchai's evolution influenced peers who had grown comfortable in dominance. Conversations shifted from legacy to longevity, from image to adaptability. Younger fighters questioned old hierarchies respectfully, encouraged by Somchai's openness. This ripple effect extended far beyond the original exchange. The aftermath did not divide communities. It connected them through shared vulnerability. What stunned the world endured because it revealed something universal. Strength measured only by reputation collapses under scrutiny. Strength grounded in preparation adapts. That understanding continued shaping how fighters approached both opponents and themselves. Occasionally, critics attempted to reframe the encounter as overhyped or inconclusive. Those arguments missed the point. The impact was never about final numbers or declarations. It was about exposure. Exposure of assumptions, exposure of blind spots, exposure of humility as a competitive advantage. Marco rarely addressed these debates, choosing silence as consistency. Somchai addressed them once, stating that discomfort was often the beginning of growth. That comment circulated widely, resonating far beyond combat sports. Schools used the story in discussions about bias and preparation. Coaches used it to warn against complacency. The mockery that sparked everything now seemed insignificant compared to the dialogue it produced. The stunned reaction was no longer shock. It was recognition, repeating quietly each time someone reconsidered what toughness actually meant when stripped of theatrics and measured under sustained pressure. As media cycles moved on, the story settled into institutional memory. It was cited in panels, referenced in training manuals, and discussed in forums dedicated to mindset rather than spectacle. Marco's name became associated with composure. Somkai's with evolution. Neither identity was forced. Both emerged organically. Fighters who never watched the original footage still absorbed its influence through those they trained under. The lesson traveled indirectly, which gave it strength. There was no need for repetition or reinforcement. The principles spoke through behavior. What followed the mockery continued unfolding without announcement. Each time someone chose preparation over bravado, the story echoed. Each time someone dismissed an unfamiliar opponent and paid for it, the lesson resurfaced. The stunned reaction remained alive not in memory, but in application, shaping decisions long after the noise faded. Marco eventually reflected privately on the moment that changed his life's visibility. He concluded that the opportunity mattered less than his readiness when it arrived. Somchai reached a similar conclusion from the opposite direction. Opportunity without humility had limits. These parallel realizations anchored the story's depth. Neither man became something entirely new. They became more precise versions of who they already were. That precision resonated. In gyms across Southeast Asia, fighters trained with renewed seriousness, understanding that perception was unreliable. Respect had to be earned repeatedly. The stunned reaction that once followed the mockery had matured into sustained awareness. The world had not witnessed a downfall. It had witnessed recalibration. And recalibration, though less dramatic, proved far more influential than any spectacle could have been. As years passed, new fighters emerged, new icons rose, and new controversies attempted to command attention. Few endured. The story of Somchai and Marco persisted because it resisted simplification. It offered no villain, no hero, only consequence. That complexity kept it relevant. Marco continued living modestly, teaching discipline to students who would one day tell the story themselves. Somchai continued mentoring, emphasizing adaptability to those chasing legacy. Neither spoke of redemption. They spoke of responsibility. Responsibility to prepare, to listen, to remain open. The mockery that once framed headlines had transformed into a lesson repeated without attribution. That anonymity strengthened its reach. The stunned reaction was no longer tied to a single night. It had become a shared understanding passed quietly from teacher to student. In reflecting on why the story endured, observers noted its restraint. There was no escalation beyond necessity, no exploitation of controversy. That restraint allowed authenticity to surface. Marco's refusal to capitalize on attention preserved credibility. Somkai's willingness to evolve preserved respect. Their choices shaped how the aftermath unfolded. Instead of polarizing communities, the encounter unified them around shared values. Discipline, preparation, humility. These principles transcended borders and styles. The stunned reaction initially captured attention because it contradicted expectation. It endured because it aligned with truth. Whenever fighters questioned narratives imposed upon them, the story resurfaced. It reminded them that readiness did not announce itself. It revealed itself only when tested. The story's influence extended quietly into other fields. Coaches outside combat sports referenced it when addressing teams about focus. Educators used it to illustrate bias and preparation. Leaders cited it when discussing the danger of dismissive authority. Marco and Somchai rarely appeared in these retellings by name. Their roles became archetypal. The underestimated practitioner. The established authority confronting limitation. That universality allowed the story to adapt endlessly. The mockery that once sparked outrage now seemed trivial, almost necessary. Without it, the lesson might never have surfaced. The stunned reaction marked the moment where perception cracked. What followed filled that crack with understanding. That process continued unfolding wherever certainty was questioned by experience. When Somchai eventually retired from competition, his farewell speech focused not on titles, but on learning. He spoke about moments that challenged him, moments that forced recalibration. Those listening recognized the reference without it being named. Marco continued training without ceremony, believing consistency mattered more than recognition. Their parallel paths illustrated the same truth. Growth rarely arrives with applause. It arrives with discomfort. The world had been stunned once. It did not need to be stunned again. The lesson had embedded itself deeply in Nug. H. New documentaries revisited the encounter with measured tone. Gone was sensationalism. In its place was reflection. Analysts emphasized how narrative framing shapes expectation, and how reality often resists framing altogether. Marco appeared briefly in one such piece, reiterating that preparation was the only thing within control. Somchai echoed that sentiment elsewhere. Their alignment reinforced the story's integrity. The stunned reaction no longer required footage. It lived in conversation. It lived in training choices. It lived in silence where arrogance once spoke free. LY. In smaller gyms, the story continued to travel without names or headlines, passed quietly between trainers and fighters who understood its meaning. It was no longer about Somchai or Marco, but about preparation meeting opportunity without noise. Young athletes learned that underestimation was not an insult, but a test of discipline. They trained longer, listened more carefully, and spoke less about potential. Coaches used the lesson to explain that confidence built on reputation was fragile, while confidence built on work endured. The encounter became a reference point when frustration surfaced, reminding fighters that progress was rarely visible in the moment. What once stunned the world had settled into practice, shaping habits rather than arguments. In this way, the aftermath matured beyond memory. It lived in daily routines, in patience under pressure, and in the quiet refusal to seek validation before readiness had earned the right to speak clearly over time. As martial arts continued evolving across borders, the lesson gained new relevance in a changing landscape. Styles blended, rules shifted, and fighters trained with broader perspectives than before. Within that evolution, the story functioned as a quiet anchor, reminding practitioners why humility mattered. Marco's composure and Somchai's recalibration symbolized a transition away from dominance narratives toward learning narratives. Gyms that once emphasized intimidation began emphasizing understanding. Competition remained fierce, but arrogance carried consequences. The encounter was no longer cited for controversy, but for clarity. It showed that effectiveness could not be ranked by origin, reputation, or volume. What stunned audiences initially had transformed into sustained dialogue, influencing how fighters prepared mentally as much as physically. The flow of the story continued forward, not frozen in a single night, but moving with the sport itself. Each generation absorbed the lesson differently, yet the core remained unchanged through shared discipline, patience, growth. When asked years later what truly endured from that moment, Marco spoke simply about preparation and restraint. He explained that silence, when supported by work, often carried more weight than argument. Somchai echoed a similar thought elsewhere, saying humility preserved relevance longer than pride preserved status. Their reflections mirrored each other without coordination, reinforcing the lesson's authenticity. The mockery that once defined the narrative now felt distant, almost irrelevant. What mattered was the response and the discipline that shaped it. The story's flow no longer depended on conflict, but on continuity. It lived in how fighters approached training, opponents, and themselves. Each retelling softened the edges of outrage and sharpened the focus on responsibility. The stunned reaction that once captured attention evolved into understanding, proving that the most lasting impacts rarely arrive with noise, but with quiet shifts in perspective over time, across cultures, generations, disciplines, globally enduring steady change. The story therefore refused a traditional ending. choosing continuity instead of closure. Marco remained in training halls, refining fundamentals and teaching awareness to those willing to listen. Somchai continued mentoring, balancing tradition with curiosity and experience with adaptation. Their paths crossed occasionally, briefly, without ceremony, shaped by mutual respect rather than rivalry. The exchange that once dominated discussion now served as a reference, not an identity. It reminded practitioners that growth was ongoing, not claimed in a single moment. Each time assumptions were challenged through discipline, the story resurfaced. Each time restraint proved stronger than bravado, its meaning deepened. What stunned the world initially became a guidepost rather than a headline. The flow carried forward naturally, grounded in practice, patience, and the understanding that mastery remained a process, never a fixed destination, shaped by humility, consistency, learning, accountability, resilience, shared effort, time, experience, perspective, growth forward, always unfolding quietly onward. Ultimately, the aftermath stunned the world because it dismantled expectation without spectacle. There was no dramatic humiliation, no manufactured rivalry, no simple victor to celebrate. Instead, there was recalibration, learning, and growth unfolding in real time. The mockery that once drew attention faded, replaced by understanding earned through experience. Somkai's certainty gave way to curiosity, while Marco's silence proved stronger than any rebuttal. Together, their encounter demonstrated that toughness could not be measured by noise, nationality, or reputation. It was revealed through preparation, restraint, and response under pressure. The story endured because it reflected something universal. Assumptions fail when tested. Discipline adapts. Respect deepens through challenge. What the world witnessed was not an ending, but a beginning that continued shaping minds long after the moment passed, leaving a lesson that remained relevant wherever confidence met reality across cultures, generations, disciplines, histories, futures, silently, steadily, enduring lessons learned together worldwide always.